everyone, and welcome to this episode of In Lay Terms. Today, I'm very, very pleased to announce that we have an amazing guest, Miss Regina Watteel. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks, Payman.
Well, are you nervous now that the camera's recording?
Yes.
Yeah.
I wish I wasn't, but every time I'm not a camera-friendly person.
Yeah, you and me both. I'm in the wrong profession, but it is what it is. Regina, can you tell us a little about yourself? Your professional background, what changed for you at the onset of the pandemic, and what you've been doing since.
Sure. My background, I have a master's and PhD in statistics, as well as an undergraduate in math and physics. Um, I My career in the past was as a principal statistician for an economics firm, and we did a lot of program evaluation and risk-benefit analysis. But I had stepped down from my position many years ago after an accident where I was pinned between two vehicles. So I stepped down ultimately to focus on family and rehab. But when the pandemic was called, the first thing I did was go to my computer, download the data, and do my own risk assessment because it comes naturally to me to do that. I'm just kind of used to looking at data and assessing the risks. And given what was happening at the time, they were going to close down everything here in Ontario for 2 weeks to flatten the curve. There was really not a lot of lead up to that decision. It seemed to come out of the blue. So it struck me as a very strange go-to to do something so drastic. So I went on the computer to see what the risks were so I could assess the risks for myself, my husband, my children, my parents, and just society at large. So when I did that, the first thing I felt was relief because it was very clear it wasn't going to be a serious risk to my children, which is always my number one priority. And in fact, it didn't seem to be a very significant risk to the majority of the population. It was clear early on that it impacted mainly seniors and those with comorbid conditions. So right away, I focused on my aging parents and my siblings in healthcare to see what I could do to help them. So I did call my parents and discuss the situation with them, ask them to lay low for a little bit until we figure out what's happening. And I talked to my brother and my sister who was in healthcare at the time. But I was alarmed at the government's response because the data did not support a lockdown. It did not support the closure of schools. And at first I figured that they were just panicking because of the global panic and that eventually they would look at the data and make more sensible decisions. But instead, it went the other way. They kept going. And I used to do a lot of risk benefit type of analysis on government contracts. So I knew that they were pretty much operating opposite to their own risk management framework, and that greatly concerned me. So from there, I was worried about what was going on, and my worries got even worse when the vaccine mandates and were announced in the summer of 2021. Then it was an extreme level of concern because I had been paying attention to everything that was coming out, including the clinical trials from these vaccines. In 2021, by the summer of 2021, it was already well known that the vaccines did not stop transmission, and there were already growing concerns of myocarditis amongst especially young males, which I have, two boys, and and my son and my daughter were required to take the vaccine in order to attend university and to stay on the varsity track team. Neither one of them wanted to take it, and ultimately they didn't, and they got booted off the team, and they got denied access to university. So it was a very stressful time. And as you know, Payman, that's also when the federal election was called. They used vaccination as a wedge issue. And I jumped into the ring basically to voice my opposition to vaccine mandates and passports. So I'm not sure.
And I think you forgot to mention the single most important part. You wrote a terrific book
Okay.
after all of
No,
this.
yeah, it's just I keep talking, so I pause, thinking, okay, I should let I should let somebody, I should let you speak. But yeah, so the issue there was I kept very good track of what was going on, and especially with transmission, because without a reduction in transmission, there is absolutely no justification for vaccine mandates and restrictions, right? So I kept good contact with a good track of those statistics. And as everybody, I'm wondering if we should go to the one slide of payment, just because it's easier for me to describe what was going on at that time, because it's very important to understand the lead up to Fisman's study. So is this full screen for you?
It is, yes.
Okay, I think it's just, oh, there we go. So I'm just going to look at the timeline here of when Trudeau called the election and then go forward from there. So Trudeau called the election in the summer of 2021. He decided to use vaccine mandates as a wedge issue for the campaign. And from there, we had a lot of pandemic of the unvaccinated narrative unfolding. So we had the Toronto Star with its shocking headlines. Did you see the Toronto Star in BC, Payman? This front page? I think everybody's seen it around the world.
This one was so particularly egregious that everyone knows about it. Like, I can't even believe that they allowed this to go. Even if you're the most extreme leftist of the Toronto Star, you'd say, like, we got to limit our liability, so let's change a few words. But this was horrible.
Yeah, it's shocking, and I don't think they ever really suffered any consequences for this. I mean, it did go everywhere. It should be embarrassing for them, but still nothing was done. There should have been something done when you have headlines that say, "I have no empathy left for the willfully unvaccinated. Let them die." That's your front page. That's. But then when you look at Trudeau and what he was saying during that same period of time, the whole "do we tolerate these people?" It was pretty shocking. It's an embarrassment, really, on Canada. But nonetheless, he somehow was reelected. And he did fund the development of provincial passports. So here in Ontario, a couple of days after he was elected, the Ontario vaccine passport came into play. Shortly thereafter, he made good on his threats to bring in vaccine mandates for the federal public service. And shortly after that, the unvaccinated were banned from planes and trains. So then we get to this problematic period here, and I say problematic in terms of the huge narrative fail when it comes to vaccines' ability to curtail transmission. So by December of 2021, we had almost 80% of the population vaccinated, and yet we started to see a surge in COVID-19 cases. And that surge was led predominantly by vaccinated individuals. So you have a complete narrative fail here, and instead of admitting that the vaccines failed to reduce transmission, the government doubled down on its rhetoric. And not only doubled down, but it increased the number of restrictions. In particularly, they put extra restrictions on unvaccinated truckers, which we all recall led to the Freedom Convoy. The Freedom Convoy was, in my opinion, fantastic. It was very, very necessary, and it was very successful in that it put a lot of pressure on the provinces to relent on their ridiculous vaccine passes. And they started to do that. And as soon as the provinces started to announce the ending of these restrictions and vaccine passports, Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act. And his government was also there was also a lot of pressure on his government to end their mandates and travel restrictions. They clearly did not want to do that. So they did impose the Emergencies Act, but that wasn't enough. And that's when we have Fisman's study coming into play. The federal government needed justification for their vaccine mandates and travel restrictions. So this is, I'm not sure if you want to talk a little bit about this specific period payment, but this is very central to not just Fisman's fraudulent study, but I'm noticing a lot of other fraudulent type of activity during this particular period of time.
So one thing I really liked, I'm going to keep this slide up for a bit and I'll take it down. But one thing I really liked is about your book, you made me realize, before I kind of knew that everything had gone to CAC, like everything went to hell. But I didn't realize that Omicron was central in that. So I look at this slide and I see, you have government oppression, all this stupid measures, and then reality hits us in the face with this Omicron, but we don't reconcile the fact that none of that previous measures worked. And then what the government does is it doubles down, and then you have a civilian sort of revolt or rebellion. And rather than, removing the impetus, they invoked the Emergencies Act. So I really liked how you told that. You tied it up in a nice, neat bow.
Right, thanks. But like I said, so the issue for the government was that a lot of the provinces did relent on their vaccine mandates and passports, and even the provinces was putting pressure on the government, on the federal government, to end its travel restrictions and its mandates for federal employees. So Trudeau and his government did need some kind of justification for keeping these going. But the problem was that the real data showed that they shouldn't be doing that. So in came Fisman's study. So Fisman's study was published a few months after the Omicron wave. And what Fisman and his colleagues did was, first of all, people might wonder, who is Fisman? So Fisman was central to the pandemic modeling. So he served on the Ontario Science Table, and he also advised every level of government when it came to the pandemic, from the municipal to the provincial to the federal government. So he was very central. And he's also a physician of internal medicine, and he's a tenured professor of epidemiology at the University of Toronto. And what Dr. Fisman and two of his colleagues did was they concocted a model to simulate fake data that showed it was the unvaccinated that had higher incident rates than the vaccinated. And as such, they pushed the narrative that the unvaccinated were a risk to others, a disproportionate risk to others. So Fisman and his colleagues basically simulated the Omicron wave, which had already taken place, and we already had real-world data that showed the opposite. But instead of looking at the real-world data, they look at their data and they try to pass off their fake results as a true reflection of reality. And those fake results were blasted across Canada and internationally within hours of the study. So this study was shocking in two things. First of all, when I read it, I see that it's blatant scientific fraud. You cannot fabricate data and results and pass them off as fact. That's called fabrication, and it is considered scientific fraud. Also, real-world data was available. He could have looked at real-world data, and he should have looked at real-world data, but it was inconvenient. So he completely ignored it, and that also is a problem. That's considered falsification when you ignore data that goes against the results you want. And the thing is that a lot of scientists brought this to the researchers' attention. A lot of scientists asked the journal, Canadian Medical Association Journal, to retract the paper and to make corrections, and they refused to do so. So that is a really big problem, because They could have corrected the record. They chose not to. And then within 4 days of this official publication, the federal Liberal MP stood in Parliament, waved the study around, and used it as justification to extend the travel restrictions. So it got a lot of publicity. Over 100 articles were written with headlines, terrible headlines, maybe not as bad as Toronto Star. They were saying they don't care people die, but they were bad nonetheless. They were they were warning of the risk of merely hanging out with the unvaccinated. And if you look at some of these articles, they were comparing, like Fisman actually came out and he made such derogatory comparisons. He compared unvaccinated people, and unvaccinated people are not disease carriers. A lot of healthy unvaccinated people walking around, and he was comparing them to carriers of syphilis and typhoid and tuberculosis. It's insane. He also made the comparison between the unvaccinated and those who drive intoxicated for the fun of it. It's but this is what was happening, and when it was brought to the attention of the Journal, they refused to do anything about it. So I can go on with what I did, but when I
I wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Did you?
Sorry, I wanted to ask you a question. Yeah, I want to ask you one about the intentions, motives, and motivations. You kind of contrasted the provinces wanted less restrictions, but the federal government just mule-headedly marched onwards with all their regulations. What is it in for? What's in for the federal government for doubling down and tripling down? Was this money? Like, are they getting profits from the vaccine purchases? What's going on?
The federal government made it very clear very early in the pandemic that they wanted everyone vaccinated. And a lot of their funds have gone into figuring out how to get vaccines into the arms of every Canadian. I don't generally speculate as to, like, I keep things very tight in terms of what they did, lay out the evidence, and I like people to use their own judgment as to why. But there's a lot of conflicts of interest, and there was a lot of money spent during this pandemic. And it was pretty clear very early on that the pandemic was a fantastic opportunity for the government to seize an immense amount of power. And the government has been able to spend an incredible amount of money with very little oversight. So from their perspective, yes, I can see why they want, like, this has just been fantastic in terms of what the government has been able to get away with. Extreme power, a lot of money. I don't know how much more you need. I mean, there's a lot of connections you have to be very careful about, and a lot of other things that are outside the scope of my book. But they're becoming more and more discussed as time goes on. But for the purpose of what I'm discussing, I just stick to the fact that it's pretty obvious the intention is to get everybody vaccinated. And the government often said things contrary to what they were doing behind the scenes. So I do go into that in the book a little bit. For example, when the government first came out and said, we're not a country that mandates vaccines, at the same time, they were procuring enough vaccines for each person to get like 10 doses. So you don't procure that amount of a product and then say you're not going to mandate or force it on the population. And then within weeks, they announced mandating the vaccine. So throughout the pandemic, you see that they are telling the population one thing, but everything behind the scenes was pretty consistent and geared towards vaccination. And when this came up with the Emergencies Act, yes, they were able to stop. Well, they tried to stop the momentum, because the momentum was that the provinces were relenting on their vaccine passports, and there was pressure for the government to do the same. If you look at Rouleau's report for the public inquiry, I find it very interesting because he goes through the timeline, and if you look at February 8th and 9th, those are the days where the provinces start to announce that they're going to end their restrictions. February 8th and 9th. And it is February 9th that the federal government comes in and puts the Emergencies Act on the table, saying we have to invoke this now. That was when they gave it serious consideration. So the timeline speaks volumes in what was going on.
Regina, let's skip ahead. You and I, we talked about the Mosley decision, and you said something to me I found really fascinating. You said Mosley talked about the impact, the negative impact of the protesters on the residents of Ottawa, but he didn't talk about the positive impact that the protesters had on millions of people across Canada. Can you speak to that?
So when I look at Mosley's report and also Rouleau's report, but when I look at their reports, I'm not looking at it from a legal mindset or the mindset of a lawyer. I look at it from the mindset of an individual whose life was greatly impacted by the vaccine mandates and passports. And I did partake in the protests, in the Freedom Convoy. I went down there many times, 13 times, plus another one once it got disbanded. But I went down there, and I could feel what was going on the ground. And I talked to a lot of people on the ground. And the overall sense on the ground, especially in the early days, was an immense sense of relief, because a lot of people had been isolated, had suffered extreme isolation up to that point. Remember, at this point in time, vaccine passports were in full force. We couldn't socialize. We could not go to restaurants. We could not go to gyms. We could not go to theaters. My kids could not go to school. A lot of our friends didn't want to talk to us anymore. We were disinvited to Christmas. You know, my daughter couldn't even travel home for Christmas because she was restricted from the flights. The isolation was horrible. And then on top of it, you had a lot of people who were put on leave or terminated from employment. So they've lost their careers, or they were isolated from their colleagues. So the isolation was extreme. And when we got together in the protest, it became the relief that people were feeling, and they were so happy to be with other people. I can't even describe the feeling when I first went down there, but it was something I will never forget. And the overall feel as time went on was celebration and happiness. And remember, we've been deprived of it for months. So this movement brought hope to millions of people at a time that it was desperately needed. And I don't think that has gotten enough play in the media, has almost none, but just in general. And so when I look at the way they describe the convoy in these legal proceedings, I find that there is an obvious bias in favor of the government and in favor of the group of residents in downtown Ottawa that have complained about the convoy. I'm not sure if maybe it's worth looking at, like, a couple of things that struck me from Mosley's decision when I read it. Did you want me to mention a couple things that stand out? Not sure.
Yeah, you're the star of this show. Take it away.
Well, I started looking at this more after talking to you on the phone, so I may as well mention it. I'll give an example. So in Judge Mosley's concluding remarks, he says this, and I find this really telling. At the outset of these proceedings, while I had not reached a decision on any of the four applications, I was leaning to the view that the decision to invoke the EA was reasonable. So he describes, he basically, he's admitting he had a preconceived bias in favor of the government. And it wasn't until he actually looked at the evidence, took a long look at the evidence, that he realized, the government really just didn't have any grounds to do what they did. And I find that good that he said that, because you find in the courts that they have, a lot of the courts do have this preconceived notion that the government is right. And the problem is that a lot of the courts aren't even looking at the evidence. That has been an issue. So at least Mosley looked at the evidence. And once you look at the evidence, you don't side with the government. And I think this is an issue when it comes to the vaccine mandates, passports, and all the restrictions, is that once you look at the actual evidence, the scientific evidence, none of those measures are backed at all. It completely falls apart. The other thing is in how they describe, this really struck me. Let's see if I have it. It was number 265 on his report. He writes, "There is no dispute that the activities and questions in these proceedings were carried out for the purpose of achieving a political or ideological objective within Canada. The participants in the protests in Ottawa and elsewhere were explicit in demanding changes to government policy." So on its surface, I can see why there's no dispute. Yeah, they wanted the government policy to change. But I look at it and I'm like, well, that's not how I was viewing it when I was on the ground, and it's not how a lot of other participants were viewing it. It was basically, we are looking at it like these restrictions and mandates that were put in place, they are unconstitutional. And what we were asking was the government to follow the law, right? So from our standpoint, it's like, I don't think it's unreasonable to demand that the government follows the law. And what I find interesting with this is we felt that these mandates were unconstitutional, and this judge found that the invoking of the EA was unconstitutional. There is a trend here. The government is doing things it shouldn't do, and there's nothing wrong with citizens demanding that they follow the law. So it's just in the wording. It seems subtle, but to me it's not. Oh. There, sorry about that. I didn't turn off my phone.
It's okay.
Little things, well, not little, but those are actually important, because it's the perspective, right? Another thing is when they talk about some of the protesters, it was like wanted a change in government, an insurrection. And I think to myself, in what country can you have a change in government by writing a memo? Like, you don't, there's all these disputes, and really you only need to write a memo or a letter. It's absurd. There was what are they calling it? A memorandum of understanding or something like that. Basically, some wrote a memo and they wanted the government to step down. I'm like, well, I don't know how you can possibly consider that an insurrection, but anyway, I think we're a little off topic. But,
No, we're not. That's exactly what I wanted to hear from you. I had Leighton Gray. He's a lawyer out of Alberta, and I was he was on the show, and I was talking to him about the same thing. Like when somebody murders someone, the judge always chimes in. They're like, "What you did was egregious. May God have mercy on your soul," or something like that. And then when the government comes in and just deprives millions of people of their right to protest, the judge, mostly, what he said was, well, yeah, but the way that you did it was technically to the letter of the law wrong. And he even specified, change this in future versions.
well, it's not just that. When you look at one of the things that comes out from both, I think Mosley and Rouleau is, well, no, not Rouleau so much, but Mosley definitely says there were other things the government could have done, right, to get the end result. And so the provinces already had laws and legislation that could have been used, and it wasn't used. And so that's where they feel that there was, the issue was with the government. They could have done other things. But one of the options that neither Rouleau nor Mosley discusses is there was one option to get rid of the protesters, one option to get, to end it peacefully was simply to end the unconstitutional mandates and restrictions. The protesters were very clear. It was very easy. End them. Follow the law, and the protest will go away. And it's funny how the judge doesn't bring up this option as an option, right? The option is how do we get, how do we remove the protesters, or how do we get rid of the blockades, which, there was other ways to get rid of them, and the blockades did end before the Emergencies Act, so the timeline doesn't even jive with what the government did. But the point is, you can physically remove people, and you can physically remove the barriers, but there was another way, and that way was simply to end the mandates that everybody can see had no justification. And the provinces themselves said, yeah, it doesn't even make sense. We're ending the mandates, because our passports, because there's no evidence that they're needed. We can't justify them. The provinces are basically saying, we can't justify what we're doing with these passports, so we're going to end them. So why didn't the government do the same and end theirs? And why are we dancing around that when it comes to these, these court cases? It has to come up that that was an option. But did they even consider it? Did they consider ending their mandates? And if they did not, why didn't they? I would think that would be central, but I don't see it anywhere in that ruling.
I'm going to go back, and I know you don't feel comfortable with this question, but it's a question of intent. Why is it that the provinces were behaving reasonably, like as you mentioned, whereas the federal government was acting unreasonably?
Well, I think that there was just a lot of pressure. The federal the convoy itself was putting a lot of pressure on the provinces, and you also had the pressure in the Conservative government. They were also going. The federal Conservative government was not government. Federal Conservative politicians were continually asking Trudeau and others to relent on their restrictions. So this was politically, there was just a lot of pressure, I believe, and the provinces knew that they could not justify what they were doing. So I just think that the convoy was successful in that regard. And when I look at the timeline and I look at what went down, it does seem to me that the federal government was the main driver of all the restrictions. The federal government was the one holding, the purse and giving the provinces money to implement the restrictions, and giving the provinces money, not just the vaccine passports, but they had given the provinces money in terms of locking down the economy during the whole COVID. I mean, CERB, for example, that was funded by the federal government. There's a lot of incentive to do what the government wanted to be done. So I feel they were the main drivers behind a lot of it, and the provinces at this point felt they couldn't justify it, so they buckled, and the federal government decided they weren't going to do that. They would do anything they could to keep their mandates in place. So I don't know. I'm not sure what you're asking, but to me, I don't know. Some people don't want to give the convoy credit for the passports being removed from the provinces, and some even say, "Oh, it was going to happen anyway." But if you look at what was being said at the time, there's no indication that was true. In fact, you had federal MPs stand up in January saying that the provinces were going to implement mandates in the near future. That's where it was headed. All right. So they already had the passports in the provinces, but they hadn't mandated the vaccine for workers. At least not here in Ontario. There was no mandate for workers, but the federal government was saying that was on its way. So it looked like more restrictions were on the way, not less. So I do believe that the convoy was instrumental in getting these the vaccine passports removed.
Yeah, you're not the first person to say that to me. A lot of people, they have that view that if the Freedom Convoy hadn't happened, we probably would still be using QR codes and vax passports.
Well, I don't know if we would still be using them, but they wouldn't have ended when they did. I don't believe they would have ended when they did unless we had that convoy. That's what it looks like from everything I can see. And the federal government, it did its best to maintain the travel restrictions and the federal mandates. But even then, like, why I don't think it would continue indefinitely, it wouldn't still be on today, is because several things were happening. So you had the convoy, it got squashed with the Emergencies Act. Then you had Fisman's study coming out saying, oh no, the unvaccinated are still a disproportionate risk. But at the same time you had, the challenge against the travel restrictions was going through with the different applicants. We had Peckford, Maxine Bernier, there was a lawyer self-representing, and then there was Carl Harrison and Sean Rickard's lawsuit that was taking place, right? And during that May and June of 2021, they were going through discoveries, and that process was showing that the government had no scientific evidence to support the travel restrictions. That's what was coming out of their discoveries. None. And there was admissions by those in Transport Canada that they didn't really have the evidence. Public Health Agency of Canada said that they never asked or never recommended the restrictions. So that would have come out eventually. But with that, I think it seems pretty clear to stop that from coming out. The government then the federal government finally lifted the mandates and travel restrictions. So that's what pushed the federal government to lift it, in order to file a mootness, what do you call it? In order to have my words are not coming out well, but in order to have that federal challenge stricken and declared moot, then they relented on their vaccine mandates and travel restrictions. So that's the timeline. So I do think that they would have come off anyway, by now anyway. One thing I do want to mention, though, is that this is not a thing of the past, because some people look at it and think, okay, well, it's in the past. The mandates are over. The travel restrictions are over. Let's move on. But the issue now is, what is the chance that this will occur again in the future? And from what I can see, there's no indication it won't happen again, because they've already done it once, and the framework and the foundation is already there to do it again. And one of the things the Fisman study does is the Fisman study tries to make the argument that because vaccines impact the community, not just the person taking it, it shouldn't be considered an individual right. That's the case they're trying to make. It shouldn't be considered an individual choice. Sorry. So they're very clear in that because it affects the entire population, it shouldn't be considered an individual choice. And the problem is that they had to use, a fraudulent study to make that point. And the real world data showed the opposite, that actually during the Omicron surge, it was those who were vaccinated that had higher incident rates, and that what the government did could possibly have made things a lot worse for the community. So it wasn't just a matter of balancing an individual with the public good. What the government did was bad for everybody, individuals and the public. So, but the thing is, that's also probably contributing to why this study hasn't gone away, why they won't resend it, because it does, acknowledging that that study is fraudulent, acknowledging that the researchers had to resort to outright fabrication in order to make their point is pretty damaging to their argument for future mandates. it's also why this study needs to be highlighted.
I have a question about how we move forward. We have a federal government that's acting unlawfully or not in the best interests of its citizens. We have institutions that are supposed to be private, like the University of Toronto, quasi-private. The funding organization from the government, I can't remember what it was, ICHR,
CIHR.
the one that handles the CIHR. So yes, it's part of the government, but it's important to understand that it's our government. So they represent us, not the party that's in power. And I look at the same thing with the courts. Yes, the courts are part of the government constitutionally, but the purpose of the courts is to enforce the law, adjudicate the law. So even if the government breaks the law, they're supposed to be adjudicating it. But you have these, they're just weaseling their way out of it with things like mootness and judicial notice. So I don't know if you can answer that question, but what's our path forward to reclaim these institutions?
Well, I can only maybe talk about my path forward. I mean, what I do, right? I look at what went on with the Fisman study, and I try to go to the journal and have the journal retract the paper, Canadian Medical Association journal. I did, and many other scientists did. They refused. So from there, I went to the University of Toronto, and I asked the University of Toronto to launch an investigation into the research and also to have the paper retracted. I gave them irrefutable proof of the scientific fraud. Right away, they said they weren't going to investigate. I went back several times to try to convince them, to change their mind. And eventually, when I backed them into a corner in terms of the proof I had that this was scientific fraud, they closed the file. So what did I do? I went to Canadian Institute of Health Research, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. They funded the study. This was a federally funded study, and it was waved around in Parliament to justify the travel restrictions. So they had a duty to set the record straight. So I asked them to do so, and then I asked them to investigate the researchers and to investigate the University of Toronto for not doing a proper for doing an investigation. At that point, the presidents of CIHR, NSERC, and SSHRC chose to do nothing. They voted to do nothing. So that's from the email correspondence I had with CIHR. It sounded like there was a purposeful decision not to investigate. Because I had continued to look into the roles of these different institutions and saw a lot of conflicts of interest and other problems that arose that I talk about in the book, I decided there was to go to the anti-rackets branch of the OPP and Ontario Provincial Police and file a complaint with them, asking them to investigate all the people and all the institutions involved in this fraudulent study. So I went to the Ontario Provincial Police, and then they refused to investigate as well. So I found it interesting because at every step I made it clear that I was going to the other organizations involved, and I made it pretty clear my intent was to get this investigated. And it seemed to me that they almost felt that they could just say no and I would go away or it would stop. I'm not sure what the thinking was. But to me it was not okay for them to say no, we're not going to investigate ourselves and I would just stop. It's so that's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book to expose the fraud, but more than expose the fraud, I've now shown that the establishment is complicit in the fraud. All right? And this is a very big problem for them because the more people that understand what we're up against, then it does put more pressure on them to investigate, and it does put more pressure on the courts to do something, right? Is it enough? Well, like I said, I'm going out there and trying to make it known, because I do think that that will have an impact. This is a provable case of fraud, and the person who was at the helm of this fraud, Dr. Fisman, he now sits at the helm of the Modeling and Strategic Unit in the new Institute for Pandemics, and he will be tasked with, leading the modeling of future emergencies and pandemics. So this is an issue. So I'm hoping at least that gets addressed. You can't. That's just completely unacceptable. So one of the things I'm looking at is highlighting that we cannot. Those who commit fraudulent modeling cannot be in charge of, modeling future pandemics. That's outrageous. Not only that, but step by step, the more you show key acts of dishonesty, I think the more likely that there will be consequences. So Fisman is to me a first step in revealing some of the deception that's gone on, and I think over time that could lead somewhere. I totally believe that it will be impactful. And I'm looking at not just Fisman, I'm looking at others right now too. And the whole, I'm not sure if this gets to your question. The issue you raise is that there's a lot going on. There's a lot of malfeasance. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot for people to focus on, and it's about where to start. And we don't see any accountability, and then people lose faith that it's even possible to get it. And what I'm doing is I look at acts that are very, very clear and have been perpetrated by specific individuals, because if you can point that out, then I think it's easier to reach a point of accountability. But more than that, the purpose behind my book, the main purpose when I wrote this book, is that I want protections to be put in place. And I feel that if I make a very strong case for putting protections in place, then I may be able to gather enough support from the public and from honest people within the establishment to make those changes. So I make it very clear in my book that I want protections in place for unvaccinated people, or just protections put in place to safeguard medical choice and to make vaccine choice a protected grounds of discrimination, so that next time there'll be that barrier, so they hopefully can't discriminate the way they did this time. Right? You read the book, Payman. I'm not sure what your take is on it, but I think the case is pretty strong that we need protections in place when you have researchers committing fraud and the establishment backing fraud in order to scapegoat a group, then you need to protect that group. I think that's pretty obvious. So that's where I'm going right now with this, is to get these protections put in place.
So what I found really alarming when I read your book, with respect to that OPP detective officer, was the fact that he was biased, which is understandable. The arguments he gave to you were, well, the response seems to be working. There's no problems. I don't have a problem. I'm quadruple vaccinated. So there's no, like, if you have a law, but the law is not being enforced, it's almost like you don't have any laws. So if the law enforcement is not pursuing it, that's my concern. Like, there's no deterrence to our federal government behaving unlawfully. That's what really got me about your book.
Yeah, there hasn't been any deterrence, but I'm hopeful that there can be, right? I don't want to sound like naive or overly optimistic, because like as you're pointing out, and as I point out in my book, why hasn't it happened yet? So there's been so much evidence of malfeasance and so much corruption within this federal government. It is shocking that they're still leading the country. It is, to me, I mean, it makes Canada look so bad. It makes our courts look so bad. It's just horrendous. And there does seem to be this feeling that they're untouchable. I don't know what to say except I will look at. I'm trying to seek ways to bring about accountability. So, from my perspective, the government could not have gotten away with what they got away with during the pandemic if you did not have key researchers backing it. All right? So this whole nonsense during the pandemic was to follow the science, right? To follow the science. Well, they didn't follow the science because the science clearly, the evidence clearly showed they shouldn't have done what they did, period. No matter how you look at it, the government did so many things that there was no scientific justification. So now you have to look at the researchers who are saying otherwise. And you have to look at those researchers and say, hey, if it wasn't for you, they wouldn't have been able to get away with what they got away with. And so I look at it and I'm like, well, here's one person, Fisman, and his fraud was obvious. So let's start there, because it's usually difficult to show scientific fraud. It's usually difficult to establish intent. But here we have a textbook case. And if we can't look at a textbook case and say, this is wrong, then yeah, Payman, I'd be very scared. There'll never be any accountability because it doesn't get more obvious than this. So I'm starting with the most obvious case that I saw and said, hey, this is obvious. So either either the system's completely corrupt and we'll get away with everything, or we'll come down and at least start here, right? So that really is my way of looking at it. And I have to say that, yeah, if nothing is done here, then I will. It's hard not to lose faith completely because this is so obvious. So at the very least, I do expect protections to be put in place. I do. I cannot accept that they won't be. And so I just keep going until I've exhausted everything I can. And right now I haven't. There's a few other things that I can exhaust, so I will continue to do that. Sorry,
Yeah,
I don't know.
no, I 100% agree. Somebody else said something similar to me where, we're going to try this thing, and if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. It's
Not just
it's not
something
just
else. Like what I found, Payman, is that they look at all the things that they're doing wrong, and because there's so much, they're actually less accountable. Because it's like, oh, everybody's doing it, and no one person's really responsible, and we did our best, and they act like there's this state of uncertainty and confusion, and you can't actually say somebody did something intentionally or wrong, and that's actually not true. That is not true. You can actually point to specific incidents of things like fraud and specific people and say, no, they knew, and I can prove it. The issue has been that the courts have not been receptive to hearing the evidence. They haven't. All right. I talk about that in my book. It's very, very frustrating to many people because right away when I looked at the scientific evidence, it's clear to me that the government cannot defend its case. And so the courts aren't making the government defend its case. They don't even have to do it. So when people say, oh, it was a pandemic, the government can do these harsh measures, I'm like, not really. They have to satisfy the charter, section 1 of the charter. And they have never been made to do that. The courts haven't done their duty. And that is a problem, because if the courts don't do it, then people are wondering, okay, what's the next step? What do we do? But the courts are not immune to public opinion. They're not. And if we can put a lot of pressure on them, maybe some of them will start to do their job, right? I think it's a good sign that we had this Emergencies Act ruling. Finally, like Mosley looked at the evidence and he's like, well, once I look at the actual evidence, yeah, the government was wrong. And that's what we need the courts to start doing. Look at the actual evidence. Let the actual evidence come to light. So and when that happens, people like me will be there with actual evidence.
Well, let's hope the courts are listening to this episode.
Well, I don't know.
Just do your damn jobs and look at the evidence.
Look at the evidence. Yes, I'm telling you, the statistical manipulations that were done during COVID are obvious, and a lot of them are very simple to demonstrate. They are, and so I'm really hoping that that comes to light.
Regina, we're approaching the hour. I wanted to read something from your book, if that's okay. It's near the end.
Yes.
I thought it was really well put. I feel like I'm reading to an elementary school, but during a campaign stop in 2021, Trudeau made specific reference to the privileges that would be given to those granted vaccine passports funded by his government. It was an interesting word choice, referring to civil liberties as privileges, coming from a man who has claimed to choose his words carefully. The federal government has announced that, this is Trudeau, the federal government has announced that we're going to pay for the development of those privileges that you get once you get vaccinated, because everyone needs to get vaccinated, and those, parentheses, unvaccinated people are putting us all at risk. And then you go on to say, throughout the pandemic, the government did indeed treat charter rights and freedoms as privileges to be granted to Canadians conditionally, as opposed to fundamental pillars of our society that are to be protected from reprisal. So I don't know, I thought that was a really, really good section there.
Thank you,
Anything you
Payman.
want to add to that?
Well, I'm glad you read from the book because, like I mentioned at the top of before we went on air, that my head's a little fuzzy today because I have a headache. So I really appreciate you reading the passage. I think it says it a lot more clearly than I'm saying it right now. All I can say is that I'm doing my best to deal with the situation as best I can. That I am hopeful that things will change for the better. I do see a lot of movement in that direction. I've made contact with a lot of people since I've written this book, and there's a lot of people with the mindset that we're going to make changes for the better. So at this point, I try to be optimistic. I really do.
Regina, I'm going to hold you over after the break, just for a few moments. But I wanted to thank you for coming on. But more so than that, I hope you realize that so many people view you as a hero. We're so grateful for everything that you're doing, and please don't ever stop doing what you're doing.
Well, I like to thank you for saying that. I don't view myself as a hero, really. I'm just doing what I think I should do and what needs to be done, and I'm hoping it makes a good difference. And I don't know how to stop, so you don't have to worry about that. But thank you, Payman, for those good words.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on, and have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.